Austin, let's start with the inflation numbers that we're at today. What do you see inside the new CPI numbers?
Pretty solid numbers. You never want to make too much out of 1 month's number, especially on inflation, because there's a lot of noise in it. But overall, it has continued before the uncertainties of the last couple of weeks. This suggests we continue on this long path toward our 2% target, let's call it, or manageable stabilized prices.
And what inside those numbers gives you a feeling that this is a part of a trend?
If you look at the components, the biggest puzzle facing us last year, the year before, coming out of the great inflation reawakening, was that if there are three major components of core inflation, which are goods, services, and housing, the biggest puzzle was housing, that the house price inflation was high and was supposed to come down. If you looked at what the market rents were, they suggested that thing should be coming down. And we went for a lot of months not seeing it. Now we've seen pretty sustained progress on housing, decent progress on services. Goods has been a little bumpier, as you might imagine, but there's a long-term trend in goods inflation toward very low, even mild deflation. So that gives me, as I look at it, gives me a little more comfort that that's on a sustainable trajectory until we got to the uncertainties of the current moment. But that's a topper.
Tell me about the uncertainties of the current moment.
Well, there's no way around viewing big tariffs as big as they've had in the U.S. in 100 years. They raise prices. So to the extent that the Fed's job by law is to stabilize prices and maximize employment, something that reduces employment and raises prices is a bit of a problem. And so we got to just figure out where is this going to settle and how's it going to work its way through the economy. In a way, the Fed's charge is to look at the hard data, the unemployment rate, the job growth, the inflation rate. But we, at moments of transition like that, turn to the soft data because the hard data only comes out with a lag.
Right.
So we're out in the Fed, and I'm out in the 7th District in the Midwest talking to business leaders, civic leaders, consumers. What's happening? What do you see? And what I've seen and what I've heard is a lot of anxiety. Anxiety of the form, are we about to go back to this period that we just lived through and we didn't like? You know, we went through a period of massively excess inflation, well higher than what anybody wanted. And before that, very large supply disruptions where you can't get chips, so you can't make car seats, so you can't make a car. So the rental car prices go up because they can't get cars. So the traveling salesmen have to pay more for rental cars, so the price of their thing goes up. And that chain that destroyed Team Transitory, that inflation wasn't transitory, it lasted far longer than you thought. There's a lot of anxiety expressed by business leaders now that they're afraid and don't want to go back to that kind of environment.
Right. So that uncertainty, that anxiety you're talking about, help people understand how that affects a business owner or a consumer as they try to make the choices in their day.
The critical element when you're thinking about, let's call it the soft data, the sentiment, is it changing people's behavior? And what you've seen is that businesses have expressed that it's changing their behavior on both sides. On one side, go front run in the anticipation there might be tariffs, go buy as many of the parts and components before the tariff gets there and just put them in the warehouse, and we can draw on that for 60 days, 90 days while these things sort out. Or on the consumer side, some of the same, let's call it front running behavior. Should I go buy an iPhone? Should I go buy a car before the tariff comes in? Or if the economy is going to start to sour, should I start building up a nest egg and stop spending in anticipation for hard times ahead? And those kinds of changes of behavior, when they start showing up in the hard data, they tend to show up quickly. So that's why I think everybody should be out looking at sentiment indices and talking to people on the ground before they start showing up in the data. How important is that going to be?
Because if it shows up in the data, by the time it does,
it's a little bit of a sunburn. Should we put on sunscreen today? I don't know. If you look down and you have the sunburn, yep, you should have put on sunscreen. And it's got a little component of that.
the behavior you talked about as people try to anticipate how this uncertainty is going to play out, is that since you were an economics professor, is that productive economic behavior?
To worry? No, it's usually not productive economic behavior to be worried and anxious. It can lead to paralysis. It can lead to reductions in consumer spending, reductions in business investment. As one business executive in the auto industry told us, you'd be crazy to do anything right now and not wait for a few months at least to figure out where things are going to settle, rather than commit yourself to a supply chain that proves outdated, obsolete because of tariffs. And that's the fear, that it's more than talking ourselves into a problem, but it is a little bit talking ourselves into a problem that the expectations can feed on themselves.
And so even if a move on tariffs might be considered good in the sense that it might lower prices, is each incremental policy announcement a contributor nevertheless to this idea of uncertainty?
It can definitely be a contributor to uncertainty if there are a lot of changes to the policy. So the fact that we're have an announcement of a big tariff and then a reduction that for 90 days we're going to have a smaller tariff, but on some countries it's going to be bigger, but there might be exceptions for certain products. All of those things contribute to, well, then just wait. Let's just wait until we figure out where this is going to settle down. If there's going to be massive retaliation in Europe, in China, and other places, of what form? Are they going to go after your business? Is it going to be things that you as a consumer, you buy every week? There's no cure when there's uncertainty, there's no cure but patience. You don't want to get stuck out on an island that's unpleasant. And that's the anxiety that I described as people feel like, wait, this is going to take us back to a period where they learned a bunch of lessons they wanted to forget. They never wanted to learn the lessons of how do you deal with almost double-digit inflation? How do you deal with we can't get the components that are necessary to make our products? They've tried to forget it. Let us never speak of that again. And now the anxiety is, oh no, we're about to have to go pull out the playbooks from the high inflation times or the COVID times.
Let me see if I can frame what it sounds like the Fed's puzzle is. One puzzle is prices might go up as a result of tariffs. The other thing is, do you see any data that suggests growth might be going down? And does that make the job harder?
That makes the job of the Fed harder if you get what is clearly a stagflationary shock, which is to say both of the Fed's jobs, maximize employment, stabilize prices, both of them start getting worse at the same time. That's not usual, but it does happen. And when it happens, there's not a generic playbook that you turn to. How the central bank responds to a negative supply shock, that's what we call it, a stagflationary thing, depends on, well, which one's worse and how long are they going to last? And are the prices going up transitorily, or is that a permanent? Or on the growth slowdown side, is this just a matter of resolving uncertainty, or is it spiraling more into recession? If you had a time machine and you could go back to the 1970s when we actually had stagflation, it's worth remembering that the person in the time machine would say, hey, what's your unemployment rate? You'd say, we're worried about stagflation. You know about stagflation. What can you tell us? Well, what's your unemployment rate? About 4. What's your inflation rate? A little over 2. They'd be like, what are you bothering me? Come on. They had unemployment in the 7s and inflation in the 13s in the 1970s. So our stagflationary shock is nothing like that. The hard data remain pretty solid. It's just we got to get through this period of uncertainty of where are things going to settle out. And if the more we get tariff shocks, geopolitics shocks, shocks to other things in the economy that look like COVID or that look like the 70s, where it's making both sides of this equation worse at the same time, the harder it is to figure out exactly what to do.
So it's nothing like the 70s, but it's more a concern than it was a year ago.
It's more a concern than it was a year ago. It's not as extreme as the 70s, but directionally, it's that stagflationary direction where you got slowdowns in output. There's a worry of slowdowns in output, layoffs potentially coming, unemployment getting worse at the same time as prices are going up. And so you get in a triangle. People would say, well, if there's danger of recession, the Fed should cut interest rates. Yes. If prices are rising and inflation's going up, the Fed should raise rates. Yes. If there's a lot of uncertainty, the Fed should wait and do nothing. Yes. And that triangle going around and around, that's the hard part.
Help me understand the situation with China right now in what appears to be a trade war. Help people understand what that means for the economy.
I mean, the first thing to note is that overall the U.S. is mostly a domestically driven economy. Imported goods are only 11% of GDP for the United States. So there is a sense in which whatever's happening in tariffs, it might not be overwhelmingly macro important for the U.S. economy. And that has been our experience in previous times, in 2018 and some earlier periods. There were tariffs. They did raise prices in the affected sectors, but they didn't really have a macro impact. China is our third biggest trading partner. There's some share of our imports. If the tariffs that we're talking about here of more than 100% go into effect, it's going to have a material impact on anything that's coming from China. That's just not even the same sport. We're not even in the ballpark of, well, let's look in the last 20, 30 years, what happens when you have tariffs of that magnitude. We've never had tariffs of that magnitude or in a very long time. So we still have to see how it's going to play out. For sure, it will affect consumer goods that you buy online that are coming straight from China. Prices will go up if they haven't gone up already, almost immediately. But the complexities of the supply chain, when we're out talking to business people, they highlight there are so many things are getting shipped. A transistor shipped from Asia to Mexico, where they put it into a capacitor that's going to go into a seat assembly, but it's not. The seat's going to get made outside of Detroit. Then that seat's going to be shipped to Canada, and they're going to combine it with some other part of the cockpit of the car. It's going to be shipped back to an assembly plant in Ohio. If every single time something in the supply chain that's a part, a component, a supply is going to get 125% tariff applied to it, there are going to be problems. Over the long run, they can fix some of those problems, but in the short run, you can't. And China is central to a lot of the supply chains for electrical and industrial equipment. So the grade is still incomplete. We don't know fully what's going to happen, and that's contributing to some of the uncertainty that people are like, let's just wait and see where this settles out.
What is the most interesting part of the economy that we're not talking about that you're interested in?
It's hard to think about something other than policy uncertainty at moments where so much seems to be happening. But it is worth taking one step back and remembering 90+% of what happens with economic growth has nothing to do with Washington. It's just the private sector doing its thing. We're innovating, we're coming up with new technologies, and that influences what the economists look at the most, which is the growth rate of productivity in the economy. It's the single most important number that you've never heard of and you're not talking about, but we should be, because it is the thing that determines how fast can our wages grow without inflation. It determines what is our standard of living over the long run. And oh, by the way, in the last 2 years, there's been a dramatic and rapid increase in the productivity growth rate. Maybe from flexibility in the workforce, maybe from the fact that we've had a big increase in business dynamism and just starting new firms, maybe because of AI and technological improvements, but it's absolutely worth keeping our eye on this thing over the long and even the medium run, because its importance for the economy ultimately dwarfs by far anything that we're talking about this week.
And tell me if my history is wrong here, but the 1960 to 1970 period that people associate with good economic conditions before the early 70s, where they the productivity growth is associated with some of the best times in American economic activity.
Of course, productivity is just output per person, output per hour of work. And if that goes up because we have better technology and we have these innovations, people can be paid more. So if you look in the 50s and 60s in the United States, boom times for productivity and for the standard of living. And then as you go into the 70s and things turn sour, productivity slows way down. Coming out of COVID, we've had a tantalizing increase in productivity. It does make you a little nervous when businesses, when they're looking at tariffs, start saying, wait a minute, if you start raising the cost of our components and supplies, it may slow our productivity, but this thing over the long run is by far the most important thing to watch.
So the uncertainty could be strangling the golden goose of productivity.
Let's hope we don't strangle the golden goose of productivity, but there are threats. I mean, if you look at other countries, the more you build walls, the less competitive, the less productive are the incumbents.
On the productivity story, does it require businesses to behave in a way that translates productivity gains into wage gains? Could there be a gap there so you'd see productivity go up, but does it not necessarily follow that wages would go up?
It's important to see there can be two sides on productivity. If there were productivity growth that is not shared in wages, that just went into corporate profits, there would be corporations who say, this is such a great boon, we can invest, we can grow the economy. So there would still be a positive, but something would be lost if that were not shared with ordinary workers. Now, the history of productivity growth and wages, there are periods where they move in lockstep. There are periods where there are some divergences, but overall, everybody agrees this is the thing that determines our standard of living. If you say, why is the average income, if you go back 100 plus years, how is it that our real incomes, even correcting inflation, are 5, 8, 10 times higher than they were in this country than they were before? How do we get to have GDP of $80,000, $90,000 a household? It's precisely because we came up with new technologies and our productivity's been great. So once you start thinking about that, it's kind of hard to think about anything else.
Productivity in the dot-com period, what's the story there, and does that offer a cautionary tale to the productivity of the moment?
There was a boomlet, and I emphasize the let. There was a boomlet at the end of the 90s, mid to late 90s, in productivity. Looking back, we attribute it to the incorporation of information technology, the internet, computers, and it had spread out of just the making of computers and the direct use of computers to retail. Walmart incorporates the computers and information technology into their inventory management. So you start seeing productivity growth in retail in a bunch of services. That was wonderful. We had a boom time. Wages grew rapidly. There wasn't inflation. And there's a caution that if you get too far ahead of yourself, then when things come back to earth, not even not even a bust,
Yeah.
but just come back to where they were before, you can be so far out over the investment overhang, we call it, but people counting on this productivity growth lasting forever, that you can set yourself up for a downturn.
Final question. Help me understand how we should think about the productivity gains, the change in the economic environment that is going to come as a result of artificial intelligence. Are we talking about a dot-com-like increase? Are we talking about something bigger than both industrial revolutions?
Yeah, look, no one knows. I shouldn't portray it like we know the answer to that. The economists, as you know, are fighting about that exact question. Is this going to last? How fast is it going to be? Is this like the bringing in electricity, or is this like bringing in, the TRS-80 computer? And so we don't know. There've been some encouraging pieces of evidence that suggest that technology and maybe even AI has been one explanatory variable in how productivity has been surging right now. If that turned into what we call a general purpose technology, which is something that gets out of just its lane and applies to the whole economy, electricity, telephones, computers, the internet, there's nothing better. That's wonderful. We would increase productivity. We will have to deal with distributional things, like certain industries get replaced by AI machines, and certain job occupations. The speed at which it happens has a major influence on that, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. How we got to be the richest economy in the world is by incorporating ideas like that. Big general purpose technologies they're what made us rich. So we want the productivity, we just need to manage the through line on it.